Hello everybody, welcome. I'm No02, thank you for watching this video. Continuing our board game journey here. The goal was to upload once every single day. I missed the day, it's gotten busy, but we're here, we're keeping on it. I feel the obligation to keep making the videos. I'm excited to keep working on this board game in general. So I will say this, there's been some success as far as forcing myself to make this video series as far as my little journey of making a deck building game about inanimate objects taking over the world, essentially. And so we're actually pretty close to getting to the point where we can start printing cards out and playtesting. I think the goals that we have left is make 3 more cards for each of the 3 card types that we have for a total of 60 cards in the main deck. Nothing too huge, but just enough to get started, right? That's the point, is just to get started. Once we start playing, feeling how some of these cards go, we might get more inspiration, more ideas, more concepts, blah, blah, blah. We still have possibility for a 4th card type, but I don't know. We're going to make the starter cards tonight. I have a really an idea that I'm quite excited about. And then we're going to make finalize the follower deck here. It'll be 4 cards. I got an idea for this as well. An idea for that as well. And if we... well, it's like 1:30 in the morning for me right now, so we may not get to these last 9 cards that we need for the 3 card types. Also, too, all the logic cards don't have any names. Not that they necessarily need them for the playtesting, right? But just something to consider. So let's go. So if you're familiar with other deck building games, the one that I'm most familiar with, the one that I've invested the most in fact, me and my little friend group used to be a part of a league for DC deck building, where we put all of the expansions together with all of the characters, and you would play competitively, and you would log who won and who got first and who got second, would score points and go into a league. And my group, we won some free stuff over the course of our participation and made content about it, things like that, right? Kind of fun. In that game, your starter deck is 10 cards, and 7 of the cards produce +1 power, which in our game would be +1 understanding. Then the other 3 cards in this 10 card starter deck would be vulnerabilities, which would do nothing. Literally do nothing. I think I have come up with a way that will replicate that sort of early game pacing, accelerate the deck into the mid game, while yet still having the effect of starter cards in your late game being a painful thing to have. The idea is, in a deck building game, you're growing in strength over time, making a stronger and stronger deck of cards. Part of that process is you add cards to the deck. That makes your deck stronger. But also, too, if you got crappy cards, you want to get them out of your deck. And the starter cards are the premium, get the heck out of my town sort of card. I think we could replicate that, right? So what we call the cards, I don't know. Right, but we're going to have 7 cards for the time being that just say +1. Right, that just say +1 understanding. That's all it's going to do. Right, literally all that's going to do. All right, we can even put in cost of 0. It's a starter card. We can do our iconic copy some spaces strategy. Copy the spaces. We'll put in VP value 0. They're a starter card. You don't get to start off with stuff. Right? Right? And then we'll just copy paste that. Right? 4, 7. The last 3 cards. Right, are going to say, and the reason why I'm writing it out like this into the spreadsheet with literally 7 different instances of this one starter card is for printing. When I print, I'm going to print out this Excel spreadsheet for the most part. You remove the lines, you print it out without the lines, and then I just cut out the card basically, and that'll be the card. And when we get to the when we make the prototype, right? How often do you get to say you make a prototype? A little glorified thing to say when it comes to making a board game, but that's what it is. That's what it is. You cannot shame me for it. When I make the prototype, I'll show it off a little bit to the camera and things like that. Because then we'll also have to write down questions, questions that I want players to answer after playing the game, right? Beta testing questions, etc. Right? But we'll get there when we get there. So the thing that I have come up with here that I think I am quite interested in seeing how plays out is that the other card, the three sort of vulnerability cards, so to speak, right? Plus one understanding, not ideal, but consistent, reliable. It's our hazard pay, right? For all you Back for Blood followers. This card will say cycle 1. Card will say cycle 1. Now, when it comes to our first 2 turns, we can do the math. We have a 10 card deck. We'll draw 5 cards. The most understanding that we can have in a single turn is plus 5 understanding. The least we can have is plus 2. Total deck rotation is a generated 7 understanding one way or another. With these cycle cards, and when I was talking about that is that's what's true of DC deck building when you have 3 cards that literally do nothing. In this, it actually does the same thing. Cycle 1 actually, having 3 cards that say cycle 1 and the first 2 turns actually replicates the same exact effect as if they would say nothing on them. Imagine the scenario. For the most part, right? You draw 4 cards. One of them is cycle 1. You have to play that cycle 1 card down into the board. You now have 4 cards in your hand and 4 of them generate power. You have to draw a card and then discard a card. Literally impossible for you to generate more power in your hand regardless of the cycle card. Thus, effectively, it's a card that does nothing when it comes to your understanding or your bonus power for this turn. What's interesting, though, is that it does accelerate your deck cycle. Where typically on turn 2, you would draw your 5 cards, and then on turn 3 is when you would reshuffle your deck and draw a new hand of card. For those of you who are not familiar with deck building games, I apologize. This might sound like gibberish to you. It'll make more sense when we do the writing the rules video, essentially. But for those of you who do understand, isn't that kind of interesting? That this cycle 1 card literally does nothing. The other scenario is, let's say you draw 3 cards that give you plus 1 understanding each, which means we have 2 cards in our hand that say cycle 1. You can play a cycle 1 card, draw a card, discard the other cycle 1 card, potentially go from a 3 understanding hand to a 4 understanding hand, potentially. Because what if you draw another cycle 1 card? You end up being stuck at 3 understanding. So the cycle 1 does end up affecting the average power per hand, essentially, where you can you end up floating around 4 power in a lot of these hands. 3 to 4 power sort of ends up being the average. And I actually think that's better. Because for the most part, it almost guarantees that on both of your first 2 turns, you'll be able to buy something, most likely from the lineup. That's sort of the goal. In DC deck building, which is a game that I love, there are some unfortunately bad opening hands. It's really rare for it to happen as far as the math is concerned, but it's having a 5 power hand and then a 2 power hand. What ends up happening is that on your 2 power hand, when you draw 2 of your 5 possible cards for power, you usually end up not doing anything on that turn, which is actually a huge deal. It's a huge major problem, because on turn 5, when you have 5 power, the chances of you being able to afford 2 cards is unbelievably rare. The chances of that 1 card that you purchase, even if it were to cost 5 power, being better than 2 cards that your opponents now have in their deck rotation, it most likely is not. It's just most likely not going to happen. This will sort of, I think, help circumvent that a little bit. So for the most part, these cycle 1 cards at the beginning of the game kind of suck for the most part in regards to increasing our overall resource per turn, our understanding. Now, when it comes to the mid-game, though, once we do have some good cards in hand, there is some nice potential to play a cycle card, discard another cycle card, discard a crappy +1, and potentially draw into something better. So it ends up being about the same in the early game, holds potential to accelerate the mid-game for every player, but in the late game, when you end up having more face cards than starter cards, right, you end up having more cards in your deck that you've purchased over the course of the game, drawing that one starter card kind of sucks. Kind of ends up being risky, but still is potentially a part of a playstyle, part of deck synergy, things like that. I actually really like this, which is why I've stopped to talk about it. I actually think that this is quite brilliant. I think the one thing that I do need to be a little worried about is having too many things that synergize with discard. Understanding that if we end up making characters that work and synergize with discard, they might have a clear and obvious advantage at the beginning of the game. Having a mechanic, right, one of the baseline mechanics in the opening starter deck could yield some balance issues based off of potential early game card purchases or what characters people are playing and things like that. But I think for the most part, this sort of reminds me of, like, I don't know if you guys ever played StarCraft 2. StarCraft 2 and, well, StarCraft in general, RTS games in general, tend to start off very slow. Particularly in StarCraft 2, you would spend literally like the first 1 to 2 minutes doing these same exact things. You'd build workers, send them to the mineral line. At this number of workers, you'd build your first depot, your first overlord, whatever. Build your first barracks or, production building. And it's just, you had to. Because there was literally no choices to be made in those early games. And if there was, they're typically very aggressive, all in, very limiting in the game, and for the most part, fairly boring as far as spectators watching the game. Great time or opportunity for the casters to talk about stuff, though. What Blizzard ended up doing was they increased the amount of workers that the players began in the game with. And it dramatically sped up the game. It dramatically increased the initial influx of economy and made way more possible openings and timings and early game decisions to be made, because instead of waiting until the 2 to 3 minute mark to really start making real decisions, you're making them closer to the 1 minute mark, closer to the 1:30, 2 minute mark, right? Just sort of in general. Really accelerated the game, which meant for the spectators, they got to see the action that much sooner. I think this sort of reminds me of that concept here. If we were to compare this to DC deck building, still has the same sort of early game effects as far as the potential power that your deck can generate over the course of the first couple of turns, but then it accelerates into the mid game. Once you do start getting those face cards, you don't mind having a cycle card here or there, but in the late game, you still end up wanting to destroy it because it's not ideal. A card that cycles one itself is not ideal, unless it generates power or something like that, right? So I am quite pleased with this. We'll just copy and paste. We just need to copy and paste. Whoops. Gotta copy and paste the spaces again. And that is our 10 starter cards. 7 that give +1 understanding, 3 that give cycle 1. That is what we're going to work with. I am, how you say, tickled pink by this idea. Self-righteously pleased with myself? I don't know. Impressed with myself. Maybe I'm a gamer after all. And then we'll move on. I think the other thing that we need to work on here, my working idea at the moment now is that we will have the World Leaders deck. These are our victory point cards, or all the cards give victory points, but these cards will be sort of consistently efficient. The price you pay to VPs gained will be more efficient than the typical cards that you will be purchasing in the lineup. And these cards will not go into your deck for the most part. These cards will just go into your victory pile, essentially. And at the end of the game, you will count the value of your victory pile plus the victory points that you've purchased in your active deck. Combine those numbers. Whoever has the highest number wins the game. The real reason, though, why we have this is that we need a mechanic in the game that helps accelerate the game to an end, essentially. And there's a bit of an issue here, multiple, but we won't go too much into it. But one major issue here is that technically no one has to buy these. You can spend the entire game farming cards in the lineup infinitely, and everyone can just sort of do that. And also, too, when it comes to like playtesting, people might just not realize or see the value potentially in purchasing these cards in general. You might end up with games that just sort of actively last too long for the most part. For the most part, at least for players who are new and don't sort of recognize that like you want to power up and then start purchasing these cards to accelerate yourself to a victory. Essentially, the idea is if you think you're winning, you should be purchasing cards from here. If you think you're losing, you probably want to farm the lineup and farm the cheaper cards, right? So the idea that I have right now is that once the world leader's deck is empty, the game immediately ends. Game immediately ends. It'll literally just say goes into victory pile, where it will then cost. It will cost my starter idea. I don't know exactly. These numbers are highly subject to change, essentially, right? Highly subject to change. I'm thinking this. If we are going to have the standard of 3 cost to 1 victory point being sort of the standard, 2 to 1 is slightly above average, and 4 to 1 is slightly below average, right? 10 to 6 would be above average. 11 to 6, extra above average. But it costs 11. Is 11 a high enough cost? Could it be 13 and 7? Possibly, right? Possibly. But we'll leave it at 11 and 6. I think I'd rather have the game go too fast, than have it go too slow to begin with, as we begin to sort of dial it in. These other cards that we'll have, I would like to have a general population. A follower stack. Yeah, maybe we'll do follower pile. I think that's funnier. And that's what's important in life, right? You know how they say that like laughter is like the best medicine, and that people who are like emotionally happy tend to be physically healthier, things like that, right? How emotions and stress and things like that can play into our physical well-being. So I sort of always love this idea of like, well, if there might be some truth in that then. So I usually think of then like eating a donut, right? People, I can't eat unhealthy food. It's bad for me. But if the food makes you happy, it's also good for you. If that donut's going to give you true happiness, I think you eat it. Otherwise, it's unhealthy not to, right? It's unhealthy to not eat that donut. Within reason, within bound. Do we want put into your follower pile or goes into victory pile? Hold on. Follower. We want follower pile, right? Yeah. Follower pile. Our pile of followers. We'll have a general population. sort of this idea of just, even though general population deck depleting doesn't end the game, it's still going to be above average cost for victory point value. So the player who can sort of like still power up but can't quite get to that 11 still has some wiggle room in how they spend their resource, right? Their understanding every single turn, mess around with it, things like that, right? We'll see how it goes. So then we'll have, a stack of this card. How many do we have? How many do we have in the stack? I don't know. Maybe 6. Maybe we put 6 cards in, right? Maybe this stack has 15. A little less consequential as far as the stack running out, but there's more of them, blah, blah, blah. I would also like to have some sort of blend here in between, right? This is super high value for cost to VP value, but also then accelerates the game. So there's a strategic choice around purchasing it, because purchasing it means that the game has moved one step closer to being over. And you get to answer that question of you as a player. Do you want the game to be over sooner or later, right? Are you ahead? Are you super strong right now? Are you worried that your opponent just purchased some really good cards in the last couple of turns and they're about to reshuffle? There's some strategy here to sort of to consider when it comes to purchasing these cards. Actually, I think we need to do, maybe we do like 12 to 7. I was just looking at this. You can purchase 2 general population cards for 10 and get 6 VPs. Sort of the same, right? Maybe we go 12 to 8. Let's go crazy. Let's go crazy. So you purchase 3 of these. That's 9 for 15. But theoretically, the plus 3 means an extra 1. We need to play around with these numbers just a little bit, right? Just a little bit. Maybe this costs 6. 6 to 3. So then at 12, we're at 6. So it's more efficient to get the higher power value over time, right? Maybe we'll have to see. We'll play. Obviously, the numbers are highly, highly, highly subject to change here. So it'll all be about like how long does it take to actually finish the game out by getting these super efficient victory point cards. The choice here is, can I sort of weave this into my purchases every other turn or so, still grow the power of my deck over time? Can I basically afford to slow myself down a little bit, but still reach a point where I can comfortably purchase these cards later on, right? Things like that. What I would like to see sort of in the middle is maybe a card that, again, has some sort of mechanic that works with the main deck, right? And sort of the main deck right now, we're sort of lacking on the mechanics, the keywords, things like that. Sort of lacking on those. Got some interesting effects going on in some of these cards, but overall, a little lacking in sort of like the baseline mechanics of the game. And we'll figure that out later. We'll figure that out later. That's sort of like literally like a theory crafting thing. Like, what weird things can we do with cards? I know, like in DC deck building, they got to the point where it's like, play this card, rotate a card 90 degrees. And there was rules and mechanics about rotating cards and things like that, right? Essentially concepts like that. But I was thinking like, oh, this card is like, what if, like, I don't know, one of these cards was like like social media presence, social media, earning the hearts and minds of the internet, right? And there might be a card in the main deck that says like, this card gives you plus XYZ plus 1 power per social media presence that you have in your victory pile or your follower pile or whatever, right? Things like that. There's some wiggle room with that. But for the most part, we'll have multiple stacks of these cards. I think we'll start off with just the 2 for now. So I figure out some mechanics that might be able to be introduced into these follower cards. So there'll be a stack of, let's say, 15 and a stack of 6. They will be available for purchase at the start of the game. Game will end when all of the world leaders have been purchased or narratively swayed under the control or follower, or now following your inanimate object. Hence the sentience, right? Hence the sentience. But it is now 2 a.m. in the morning for me, so been lagging. I've been behind, but I'm glad I got this out there. But there was it's all coming together, right? It's all coming together. We literally only have 9 cards to design between logic, feelings, and creativity. We'll try and name some of the cards. And then we need to come up with abilities for our inanimate objects that we will be portraying in this board game. We'll figure that out. Maybe we won't have them. Maybe we will. And then we'll start the printing. We'll get to a printing. So, anyway, thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate it. Hope you're doing well, and I'll see you guys in the future.